In survey after survey of historians, one name is always at the very bottom: James Buchanan, the worst president in American history. On paper, he was a political titan, one of the most qualified men ever to seek the office. So how could a world-class diplomat preside over the complete and total collapse of the United States? This isn't just a story about mistakes, it's the story of how a brilliant career built on compromise became the perfect recipe for disaster. How a rigid, legalistic mind, when confronted with a great moral crisis, chose paralysis over principle and inaction over leadership, leading his nation down the road to its bloodiest war. James Buchanan was born in 1791 at Cove Gap, Pennsylvania, into a prosperous merchant family of Ulster Scots immigrants, a product of a hardy, self-reliant culture and a stern Presbyterian faith. His father was a hard-working Ulster Scots immigrant who built a business from nothing, while his mother was a well-read and intelligent woman. From them, Buchanan inherited a blend of frontier pragmatism and a reverence for classical education and the law. His sharp intellect took him from a local academy to a successful and lucrative law practice in Lancaster. From them, Buchanan inherited a blend of frontier pragmatism and a reverence for classical education and the law. His sharp intellect took him from a local academy to a successful and lucrative law practice in Lancaster. It was here, in the refined and close-knit society of early 19th century Lancaster, that a personal tragedy would reshape his life forever. In the refined and close-knit society of early 19th century Lancaster, James Buchanan was an eminently eligible bachelor. He was handsome, wealthy, and intellectually brilliant, with a burgeoning political career. It was in these circles that he met Anne Caroline Coleman, the daughter of Robert Coleman, Pennsylvania's first millionaire. Robert Coleman was an industrial titan, an iron magnate of immense power and influence, whose furnaces forged the raw materials of a growing nation. The Colemans lived in a world of staggering wealth and social prestige. Anne, born in 1796, was the youngest of a large and powerful family. Lancaster society celebrated her beauty, her vivacity, and her cultured upbringing. But behind the polished surface, friends and family knew a different Anne, one who was exceptionally sensitive, shy, and prone to periods of intense melancholy, a condition that today might be diagnosed as clinical depression. Their courtship began in 1818 and quickly became the talk of Lancaster society. It was a whirlwind affair, a union of a self-made political star and a celebrated heiress. In the summer of 1819, they became engaged to be married. On the surface, it should have been the beginning of a fairy tale, but beneath the veneer of social propriety, the relationship was fraught with pressure and misunderstanding. Buchanan, now a member of the state legislature and managing a demanding legal practice, was often away from Lancaster, consumed by his professional duties. His ambition was a powerful engine, but it left little time for the constant attention and reassurance that a sensitive soul like Anne seemed to require. His letters to her, by most accounts, were infrequent and reflected his naturally reserved and formal character. They were proper and intelligent, but they lacked the effusive passion and warmth that Anne craved. Into this void of emotional distance, cruel whispers began to circulate. The gossip, amplified by the small-town rumor mill, and perhaps even encouraged by Anne's protective family, was poisonous. It suggested that Buchanan, the boy from the log cabin, was more interested in the vast Coleman fortune than in their daughter's heart. He was, the gossiper said, a fortune hunter, a cold and calculating man using Anne to secure his social and financial position. There is no concrete evidence to support this charge. Buchanan was already a wealthy man in his own right, but the perception lingered. Whether Anne truly believed these rumors or was simply worn down by Buchanan's perceived neglect and emotional distance, we will never know for certain. But in late November of 1819, after a tense period during which Buchanan was seen socializing with another woman in public, Anne wrote him a letter, breaking off their engagement. Distraught, Buchanan tried to meet with her, but she refused to see him. A few days later, Anne traveled to Philadelphia to stay with her married sister. On the evening of December 9th, she was found unconscious in her room. She died a short time later. She was only 23 years old. The official cause of death was recorded vaguely as hysterical convulsions, a common 19th century euphemism, often used to obscure possible suicides. But the truth, whispered in horrified tones through Philadelphia and Lancaster society, was that she had died of an overdose of laudanum, an opium tincture that was readily and legally available as a sedative. It was widely believed to be a suicide, a final act of despair. Buchanan was utterly devastated, plunged into a grief so profound and complicated by guilt that it would redirect the entire emotional course of his life. He wrote a desperate, heart-wrenching letter to Anne's father, professing his undying love for her and begging for permission to view her body and to walk as a mourner at her funeral. The letter, a rare glimpse into the passionate heart that lay buried beneath his formal exterior, was returned to him, unopened. The Coleman family, shattered by their grief, held him directly responsible for her death. He was barred from the funeral, shut out completely, left to contend with his immense sorrow and the town's silent accusations alone. The experience broke something inside him. He wrote to a friend, "I feel that happiness has fled from me forever." In the wake of the tragedy, James Buchanan made a solemn vow. He would never marry, and he never did. He would go on to achieve the highest echelons of power, to stand in the courts of kings and command the attention of the world, but he would do so as a solitary man. This deep, unresolved personal tragedy didn't just shape him. It locked away a vital part of his humanity. It forged in him a profound aversion to risk and an emotional detachment that would become his defining political tools. But this very armor, built to protect a broken heart, would later prove to be his nation's greatest vulnerability when it desperately needed a leader who could feel its pain, not just analyze its laws. His first great test on the national stage had been one of love and loss, and he had failed it in a way that would haunt him for the rest of his days. His future tests would be political, but they would demand the very human connection he had seemingly lost the capacity to forge. With his personal life irrevocably altered, Buchanan threw himself entirely into his public ambitions. Politics and law became his sole refuge, the arena where his intellect and discipline could find their fullest expression and perhaps serve as a balm for his wounded spirit. His political journey had already begun. In 1814, while his legal career was just taking off, he was elected to the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. He ran and won as a Federalist, the party of George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, which generally favored a strong central government and close ties with Great Britain. His entry into politics was a baptism by fire. The nation was embroiled in the final, desperate year of the War of 1812 against Great Britain, a conflict that deeply divided the country. Many Federalists, particularly in New England, were so vehemently opposed to Mr. Madison's war that they were holding a convention in Hartford, Connecticut, to discuss their grievances, with some even whispering of secession. But James Buchanan, a rare pro-war Federalist, was a fervent patriot. His frontier upbringing had instilled in him a deep and abiding love for his country and a suspicion of foreign powers. In August of 1814, when the unthinkable happened, British forces captured Washington, D.C. and burned the White House, the Capitol, and other public buildings to the ground. A wave of shock and outrage swept the nation. In Lancaster, the young legislator Buchanan delivered a fiery, impassioned speech. He excoriated the British for their act of wanton barbarity and castigated those in his own party who spoke of submission. He declared that it was the sacred duty of every citizen to rise to the defense of the Republic. He did not just talk, he acted. At the age of 23, James Buchanan briefly volunteered as a private in the Pennsylvania militia during the War of 1812. He performed support duties near Baltimore, but did not see combat. His company was assigned to a support role, guarding supplies and helping to round up horses for the cavalry. While they did not see major combat during the climactic battle for the city, the battle that inspired Francis Scott Key to write the Star-Spangled Banner, his service was honorable. His willingness to put on a uniform and risk his life for his country, especially when many in his party were opposing the war effort, bolstered his credentials as a patriot and demonstrated a commitment to national defense that would remain a cornerstone of his political philosophy for the next half-century. After the war, the Federalist Party, tainted by its opposition to a conflict that ended in a surge of American nationalism, rapidly disintegrated. Buchanan, ever the political pragmatist, saw that the future lay with the ascendant Democratic-Republican Party, the party of Jefferson and Madison. He gracefully transitioned his allegiance, aligning himself with the forces that would soon coalesce around the charismatic figure of Andrew Jackson. His reputation as a brilliant lawyer, a war veteran, and a compelling orator continued to grow. In 1820, he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, beginning a decade of service that would see him become a key player in the tumultuous politics of the era. Washington, D.C. in the 1820s was a city of contradictions. Muddy streets ran past grand, unfinished buildings. It was a hothouse of ambition, factionalism, and fierce debate. Here, in the contentious halls of Congress, the nation's future was being hammered into shape. Into this chaotic world stepped James Buchanan. He quickly distinguished himself, not with charm, but with diligence. His legal expertise was a weapon, and on the powerful House Judiciary Committee, he wielded it with precision. He took a keen interest in national economic policy, consistently advocating for protective tariffs to support Pennsylvania's growing iron and manufacturing industries, and for federal funding of internal improvements like roads and canals to unite the sprawling, disconnected nation. He was shaping his political identity as a Jacksonian Democrat, a patriot, a believer in states' rights and a limited federal government, but also a pragmatist who understood the need for federal action to promote economic growth. His journey from the log cabin of Stony Batter to the halls of Congress was complete. He had overcome personal tragedy and political upheaval to establish himself as a rising star on the national stage. The next phase of his career would take him far beyond America's shores, into the gilded palaces and shadowy corridors of European power, where he would hone the skills that would make him one of America's most accomplished diplomats, a reputation that would later stand in such stark, ironic contrast to his presidential legacy. The making of James Buchanan the statesman was well underway. James Buchanan's decade of service in the House of Representatives had transformed him from a promising Pennsylvania lawyer into a seasoned and respected national politician. He had mastered the intricate dance of legislation and debate, earning a reputation for diligence, intellectual rigor, and, above all, party loyalty. This loyalty would become the defining feature of his career as he navigated the tumultuous political realignment of the 1820s. The so-called era of good feelings, a period of one-party rule by the Democratic Republicans, shattered in the contentious presidential election of 1824. The election was a four-way struggle between national titans: Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans; John Quincy Adams, the brilliant Secretary of State; Henry Clay, this powerful Speaker of the House; and William Crawford, the Secretary of the Treasury. When no candidates secured a majority of electoral votes, the election was thrown into the House of Representatives, where Buchanan and his colleagues would decide the nation's fate. The election descended into chaos. Henry Clay, now out of the race, held the power to choose the next president. He made his choice, John Quincy Adams. Almost immediately, Adams nominated Clay to be his Secretary of State, the traditional stepping stone to the presidency itself. The deal was done. To Jackson supporters, this wasn't politics. It was a betrayal. They gave it a name that would echo through history: the corrupt bargain. James Buchanan, who had actively supported Jackson's campaign in Pennsylvania and had a deep respect for Henry Clay, was initially caught in the middle. But the blatant political maneuvering disgusted his sense of propriety and fair play. The corrupt bargain was a clarifying moment for him. It pushed him decisively and permanently into the camp of Andrew Jackson. Over the next 4 years, Buchanan became one of the most relentless and effective critics of the Adams administration. He chaired the House Judiciary Committee and used his position to launch investigations and deliver powerful speeches against what he saw as the administration's overreach and elitism. He had hitched his wagon to Jackson's star, embracing the populist, states' rights-focused ideology that would become Jacksonian democracy. When Jackson swept into the presidency in 1828 on a tidal wave of popular support, Buchanan was recognized as one of the key architects of the victory, a loyal and powerful lieutenant who had earned a place in the new administration's inner circle. An influential post in Jackson's cabinet seemed his for the taking. But Jackson, a man who valued loyalty but was also a shrewd manager of political talent and ambition, had other plans. Instead of a domestic post, he offered Buchanan his first major diplomatic appointment, minister to the Russian Empire. In 1832, Buchanan set sail for St. Petersburg. It was, in some ways, a form of political exile, a way for Jackson to reward a key supporter while also removing a potentially powerful rival from the daily political fray of Washington. For Buchanan, it was the beginning of a new and transformative chapter in his life. He was plunged into a world utterly alien to his American experience. St. Petersburg was the glittering autocratic heart of the Russian Empire, a city of opulent palaces and rigid social hierarchies, all ruled by the iron-fisted and deeply conservative Tsar Nicholas I. It was a world of military pageantry, courtly intrigue, and a bureaucracy as vast and frozen as the Russian winter. Here, the principles of American democracy were seen as a dangerous and subversive poison. Buchanan's primary mission was to negotiate the first ever comprehensive commercial treaty between the two nations, an objective that had eluded previous American diplomats. The task was formidable. He had to navigate a labyrinthine foreign ministry, overcome the Tsar's inherent suspicion of republics, and persuade a government built on protectionism to open its ports to American trade. For nearly 2 years, he engaged in a patient, painstaking diplomatic campaign. He mastered the elaborate etiquette of the Russian court, used his personal charm to build relationships with key ministers like Count Karl Nesselrode, and deployed his legal acumen to draft and redraft treaty proposals. His letters from this period reveal a man both fascinated and isolated, impressed by the grandeur of the imperial court, but deeply lonely and longing for the familiar political battles of home. Finally, his persistence paid off. The Russo-American Treaty of 1832 established permanent commercial relations and granted reciprocal trading rights and legal protections for merchants of both nations. It was a quiet, unglamorous victory, won not through bluster, but through careful, methodical negotiation. It was a triumph of statecraft that proved Buchanan's remarkable aptitude for the subtle art of diplomacy and greatly enhanced his stature back in the United States. He had proven he could succeed on the world stage, holding his own with the crowned heads of Europe. But the quiet victories of diplomacy were behind him now. Buchanan returned from Russia in 1834 to a hero's welcome and was promptly elected to the United States Senate. He was about to enter the grand theater of American politics, a place where the battles were louder, the stakes were higher, and the compromises were far more dangerous. This was the grand theater of American politics, a stage occupied by a generation of legislative giants. It was here that Buchanan would spend the next 11 years, solidifying his position as a leader of the Democratic Party and a key player in the defining political battles of the antebellum era. He was no longer just a congressman from Pennsylvania. He was a national figure, a trusted counselor to presidents, and a powerful voice for the Jacksonian Creed. His unwavering party loyalty was tested almost immediately in the brutal political conflict known as the Bank War. Andrew Jackson, in his crusade against what he saw as aristocratic privilege, had targeted the Second Bank of the United States, a powerful, privately run institution that acted as the federal government's financial agent. Jackson viewed the bank as a corrupt, unconstitutional monopoly that concentrated too much power in the hands of a wealthy, unelected elite. He famously vowed, "The bank is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." Buchanan found himself in an exceedingly difficult position. The bank was headquartered in Philadelphia and was a vital and popular institution in his home state of Pennsylvania. Many of his constituents, and indeed the state's entire political establishment, supported it. Yet Buchanan's loyalty to Jackson and the National Democratic Party was absolute. He chose party over state, principle over expediency. He became one of the administration's most eloquent and effective defenders in the Senate, delivering powerful speeches that echoed Jackson's populist rhetoric. He argued that the bank was a monster of financial power, a hydra of corruption that threatened the very foundations of Republican liberty. He threw his full intellectual weight behind Jackson's veto of the bank's recharter bill, a move that sent shockwaves through the American economy, but cemented Jackson's image as a champion of the common man against the money power. This performance defined Buchanan's career. By defying powerful interests in his home state to serve the National Party, he forged a reputation as a man of unwavering discipline. This act earned him the undying gratitude of the Jacksonians. His Southern colleagues in particular now saw him as a man of principle, a man they could trust. It was also during his time in the Senate that Buchanan's views on the nation's most perilous issue, slavery, began to harden into the position that would define his later career. As abolitionist societies grew in the North, they began to flood Congress with petitions demanding the end of slavery in the District of Columbia. These petitions infuriated Southern congressmen, who saw them as a direct assault on their institutions and their honor. To preserve peace and the unity of the Democratic Party, Buchanan became a leading advocate for the gag rule, a controversial procedural tactic that automatically tabled all anti-slavery petitions without them being read or debated. He argued that while the right to petition was sacred, The constant agitation of the slavery issue by Northern fanatics was a dangerous incitement that threatened to tear the Union apart. And it was here, in the Senate, that we see the fatal flaw begin to harden. When abolitionists flooded Congress with petitions to end slavery, Buchanan faced a choice. Privately, he sometimes described slavery as a misfortune, but politically, he defended it as a constitutionally protected institution. But politically, he made the calculation that would define his life. He chose to silence the debate. To him, the unity of his party, which depended on the South, was more important than the moral cry for freedom. This choice earned him a powerful nickname, Doughface, a Northern man with Southern principles, a name that would follow him all the way to the White House. It was a calculated political stance designed to make him a viable national candidate in a party that depended on Southern votes. It was also a moral compromise that would have catastrophic consequences. By 1844, James Buchanan was one of the most powerful and respected men in the Democratic Party. When James K. Polk, a hard-driving expansionist and fellow Jacksonian from Tennessee, won the presidency on an aggressive platform of territorial acquisition, he knew exactly who he wanted as his Secretary of State. The position was the most prestigious in the cabinet, the chief architect of the nation's foreign policy. Polk chose Buchanan. The 4 years from 1845 to 1849 would be one of the most consequential periods of American expansion, and Buchanan would be at the very center of it all, the indispensable right-hand man to a president with boundless imperial ambitions. The nation was gripped by the spirit of manifest destiny, the quasi-religious belief that the United States was divinely ordained to expand its empire of liberty across the entire North American continent. Buchanan's desk at the State Department became the nerve center for this audacious and often ruthless project. His first great crisis was the Oregon question. For decades, the United States and Great Britain had jointly occupied the vast Oregon country, a wilderness stretching from the Rockies to the Pacific. During the 1844 campaign, expansionists popularized the slogan 5440 or fight, claiming the U.S. should assert control up to latitude 54 degrees 40 minutes, though Polk himself quietly aimed for compromise. The slogan was a political firecracker, but a war with the British Empire, the world's foremost military and naval power, would be a catastrophic gamble for the young republic. President Polk, for all his public bluster, knew this. He entrusted Buchanan with the delicate and dangerous task of finding a diplomatic solution. The negotiations were a masterclass in international brinkmanship. Buchanan engaged in a prolonged, tense diplomatic chess match with Richard Pakenham, the highly skilled British minister in Washington. He had to project strength to appease the expansionist hawks in his own party, while simultaneously signaling a willingness to compromise to the British to avoid a disastrous war. At times, Polk's aggressive public posture and inexperience in foreign affairs nearly scuttled the talks, but Buchanan's steady hand, deep knowledge of international law, and patient diplomacy prevailed. In June 1846, they shattered the stalemate. The Oregon Treaty extended the existing U.S.-Canadian border along the 49th parallel to the Pacific Ocean, securing for the United States the magnificent prize of the Pacific Northwest, the future states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, and its first deep-water ports on the Pacific Ocean. Buchanan had stared down the British lion and won, all without firing a single shot. It was a monumental diplomatic triumph. But even as the ink was drying on the Oregon Treaty, a far more violent chapter of American expansion was unfolding on the nation's southern border. The annexation of Texas in 1845 had led to a bitter border dispute with Mexico, which still considered Texas its own territory and had broken off diplomatic relations. President Polk, eager to acquire more land, particularly the prized territory of Alta California, with its magnificent harbor at San Francisco, sent troops under General Zachary Taylor into the disputed region between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. In April 1846, Mexican forces, viewing this as an invasion, attacked an American patrol. Polk now had his pretext for war. Buchanan's role was complex and crucial. He helped draft Polk's fiery war message to Congress, a document that skillfully, if disingenuously, portrayed the United States as the innocent, aggrieved party, declaring that Mexico had shed American blood upon American soil. Throughout the two-year conflict, Buchanan was a key member of Polk's war cabinet, advising on military strategy and, most importantly, managing the foreign policy implications of the war, ensuring that Britain and France remained neutral. As American forces marched victoriously across Mexico, capturing Mexico City itself, Buchanan turned his attention to the endgame, crafting a peace that would secure the administration's vast territorial ambitions. The process was fraught with difficulty. The Mexican government was unstable and chaotic, and the American Peace Commissioner, Nicholas Trist, a State Department clerk appointed by President Polk, helped negotiate the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Yet Buchanan persevered, drafting the essential protocols and diplomatic frameworks that would guide the negotiations. The negotiations culminated in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in February 1848. Mexico, in defeat, was forced to cede a staggering expanse of territory, what is now California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. In exchange, the United States paid Mexico $15 million and assumed the debts owed by the Mexican government to American citizens. It was a staggering acquisition, adding over 500,000 square miles to the United States and transforming it into a true continental empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. As Secretary of State, James Buchanan had orchestrated the largest single territorial expansion in American history since the Louisiana Purchase. His reputation as a statesman and diplomat of the first rank was now unassailable. He had proven himself to be a master of both peaceful negotiation and the diplomacy of warfare. Yet the vast new territories acquired in triumph brought with them a poisonous dilemma that would ultimately unravel his life's work and the nation itself. Would these new lands be dedicated to freedom or consecrated to human slavery? That poisonous question would haunt the nation for the next decade. For a time, Buchanan escaped it, enjoying a brief retirement, but the lure of power was too strong. In 1853, he accepted the most prestigious diplomatic post in the world, Minister to Great Britain. It was meant to be the crowning achievement of his career. Instead, it would lead him to commit his most infamous act. This posting in London should have been a distinguished capstone to his long and brilliant career. Instead, it would become the source of his most infamous diplomatic act, one that would starkly reveal the pro-Southern sympathies that had been quietly guiding his politics for decades. The issue was the island of Cuba. The Pearl of the Antilles was a Spanish colony, but for years it had been coveted by a powerful and aggressive faction of Southern politicians in the United States. They saw Cuba, with its thriving sugar plantations and large enslaved population, as a potential new slave state, a way to bolster their diminishing power in the U.S. Senate. They also lived in mortal fear that Spain, under pressure from abolitionist Britain or France, might emancipate Cuba's slaves. They believed this would create a black republic just 90 miles from Florida, a terrifying beacon of freedom that could inspire slave rebellions in the American South. In 1854, on secret instructions from the Pierce administration, Buchanan traveled from London to Ostend, Belgium, for a clandestine meeting. He was joined by the American minister to Spain, the hot-headed Pierre Soule of Louisiana, and the American minister to France, John Y. Mason of Virginia. The three men, all pro-slavery Democrats, were tasked with devising a unified strategy for acquiring Cuba. The result of their meeting was a confidential dispatch sent to the State Department that would later become known to the world as the Ostend Manifesto. The document was a shocking piece of diplomatic aggression, a stark assertion of manifest destiny fueled by the paranoia of the slave power. It argued that the United States should first offer Spain up to $120 million for Cuba. If Spain, actuated by stubborn pride and a false sense of honor, refused to sell, then the security of the United States itself would be endangered by the threat of a slave revolt in Cuba. And if that threat became real, the manifesto declared, "By every law, human and divine, we shall be justified in wresting it from Spain if we possess the power." It was a bald-faced assertion of might makes right, a justification for naked conquest, cloaked in the flimsy language of national security. Buchanan and his fellow diplomats intended the manifesto to be a secret, a confidential recommendation for the administration's eyes only. Although intended as a confidential dispatch, its explosive contents became public in 1855 when Congress released diplomatic papers, igniting an immense political firestorm. In the North, it was seen as definitive, irrefutable proof of a slave power conspiracy, a shadowy cabal of Southern slaveholders who had seized control of the federal government and were now plotting to hijack American foreign policy to expand their evil empire of human bondage. The newly formed Republican Party seized on it as the ultimate evidence of the moral bankruptcy of the Democratic administration. The international condemnation was equally fierce. The manifesto was denounced throughout Europe as the creed of a robber nation, the thuggish logic of a highwayman. The Pierce administration, humiliated and exposed, was forced to publicly repudiate the document, and the plan to acquire Cuba was dead. The Ostend Manifesto was a diplomatic disaster and a profound moral stain on all involved. But for James Buchanan, the fallout was paradoxically beneficial. While the manifesto horrified the North, it transformed him into a hero in the South. This act, more than any other, was the ultimate proof of his political creed. It cemented the very reputation he had carefully cultivated for decades, erasing any doubt that he was the ultimate doughface, the one Northern man the South could implicitly trust to defend their cause no matter the cost. It was this reputation that made him the perfect compromise candidate for the Democratic Party in its hour of need in 1856. He had been conveniently out of the country, serving in London during the bloody firestorm over the Kansas-Nebraska Act, meaning he was untainted by the domestic battles that had so bitterly divided the nation. He was the seasoned diplomat, the elder statesman, the one man, it seemed, who could appeal to both North and South and hold the fragmenting Union together. The very skills he had honed in St. Petersburg and London, combined with the pro-Southern compromises that had defined his career in Washington, had brought him to the pinnacle of political power, a nomination for the presidency of the United States. But the foundation of that success, his unwavering commitment to appeasing the South, would prove to be the fatal flaw that would lead both his presidency and his country to utter ruin. The presidential election of 1856 was one of the most consequential and venomous in American history. The nation was a cauldron of sectional animosity, boiling over from the violence of bleeding Kansas. The old political order was dead. The Whig Party, which for a generation had provided a national alternative to the Democrats, had disintegrated over the slavery issue. In its place, two new and volatile forces had emerged. From the North rose the Republican Party, a purely sectional organization forged in the fires of opposition to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Their platform was revolutionary. They did not seek to abolish slavery where it existed, but they were adamantly, unshakably committed to preventing its expansion into any new Western territories. They nominated the dashing explorer John C. Fremont, the Pathfinder, as their first standard bearer. To the South, the Republican Party was not a political opponent. It was an existential threat, a hostile, abolitionist-driven movement that sought to encircle and eventually strangle their entire way of life. Attempting to find a middle ground was the American Party, a nativist movement popularly known as the Know-Nothings. They sought to redirect the nation's passions away from the slavery issue and toward a fear of immigrants and Catholics. Nominating former President Millard Fillmore, they hoped to be a party of national unity, but they served mostly as a way station for homeless former Whigs, unable to stomach either the pro-slavery Democrats or the anti-slavery Republicans. This left the Democratic Party, the last remaining truly national political institution, staggering under the weight of holding the Union together. Their incumbent president, Franklin Pierce, and their leading senator, Stephen A. Douglas, were both damaged goods, seen as directly responsible for the chaos in Kansas. They were too controversial, too divisive. The party needed a savior, a man who seemed to be above the fray, a safe pair of hands who could calm the turbulent waters. They found their man in James Buchanan. He was, from a political standpoint, the perfect candidate for a nation on the brink of a nervous breakdown. Having spent the previous 3 years as minister to Great Britain, he had been conveniently absent during the firestorm over Kansas. He was untainted by the domestic bloodshed. Hailed as Old Buck, he was presented as a seasoned, sober elder statesman. He was acceptable to the South because of his long and consistent record of defending their interests, a record capped by his authorship of the Ostend Manifesto. He was tolerable to many in the North because he was a Pennsylvanian who spoke the language of compromise and promised, above all, to preserve the Union and uphold the rule of law. The campaign was vicious. Southerners openly threatened secession if the black Republican Fremont were to win. Republican orators painted Buchanan as a tool of the slave power, a decrepit old functionary who would sell out the North. Buchanan's campaign was simpler and more powerful. He was the only candidate who could save the Union. On Election Day, that argument carried the day, but just barely. Buchanan won by carrying every slave state plus 5 crucial free states, his own Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Indiana, Illinois, and California. The victory revealed a terrifying political map. The Republicans, in their very first presidential contest, had swept New England and the Upper North, demonstrating incredible strength and showing that the nation was now politically polarized along a clear geographical line. Buchanan had won, but he would preside over a nation that was already, in effect, 2 separate countries. On March 4th, 1857, a clear, cold day in Washington, James Buchanan, at the age of 65, stood on the east portico of the Capitol and took the oath of office as the 15th President of the United States. He looked the part of a national savior, tall, dignified, with a shock of white hair and a formal old-world courtliness. In his inaugural address, he sought to project an air of calm and finality over the issue that was tearing the nation apart. He spoke of the territorial slavery question, the source of so much strife as a matter of little practical importance that had been needlessly agitated for mischievous purposes. Then he made a fateful and, as it would turn out, deeply deceptive announcement. The question of when the people of a territory could decide on slavery, he declared, was a judicial one which legitimately belongs to the Supreme Court of the United States, before whom it is now pending, and will, it is understood, be speedily and finally settled. He urged all good citizens, in the spirit of patriotism, to submit to the court's forthcoming decision, whatever it might be. It sounded like a reasonable, statesman-like approach, a plea to defer to the impartial wisdom of the judiciary to resolve an intractable political problem. But it was a calculated deception. James Buchanan already knew what the Supreme Court was going to decide. In a shocking breach of the constitutional separation of powers, he had been privately corresponding with Justices John Catron of Tennessee and Robert Grier of Pennsylvania. Justice Catron had written to the president-elect, informing him of the court's leanings and suggesting that a word from Buchanan might persuade his fellow Pennsylvanian, Justice Grier, to join the Southern majority. Buchanan eagerly complied, writing to Grier and pressuring him to side with his Southern brethren, to issue a broad, sweeping ruling that would give the decision a more national, less sectional appearance. This was a secret back-channel conspiracy to use the prestige of the Supreme Court to achieve a political end, to kill the anti-slavery movement and destroy the Republican Party by declaring its central platform unconstitutional. It was the greatest gamble of Buchanan's career, a move he believed would bring peace and cement his legacy as the savior of the Union. It would instead ignite a firestorm that would consume his presidency and the nation itself. Just 2 days after Buchanan's inauguration, the judicial bombshell he had helped to engineer exploded. The Supreme Court, led by the 80-year-old Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, a Marylander and former slaveholder, delivered its infamous decision in the case of Dred Scott v. Sanford. The case had been brought by Dred Scott, an enslaved man who had lived for years with his master, an army surgeon in the free state of Illinois and the free territory of Wisconsin, part of the Louisiana Purchase, where slavery had been banned by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Scott sued for his freedom on the widely accepted legal principle of once free, always free, arguing that his residence on free soil had made him a free man. The court's ruling was not just a denial of Scott's personal claim. It was a judicial earthquake that aimed to rewrite the very definition of American citizenship and liberty, and to settle the slavery question permanently in favor of the South. The decision, written by Chief Justice Roger Taney, was a judicial earthquake that aimed to settle the slavery question permanently in favor of the South. The ruling declared that Black Americans, whether free or enslaved, were not citizens and had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. It wiped out the Missouri Compromise, a law that had stood for 37 years, effectively nationalizing slavery by making it unconstitutional to ban it in any federal territory. For Southerners, it was a moment of profound vindication. For the North, it was a catastrophe, seeming to confirm their darkest fears of a slave power conspiracy that had now captured the Supreme Court. President Buchanan celebrated it as the final answer, but it was perhaps the most disastrous political miscalculation in American history. For the North, it was a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. It seemed to confirm their darkest fears of a slave power conspiracy that had now secretly captured not only the presidency, but the Supreme Court itself. Abraham Lincoln charged that the Dred Scott decision looked like the product of a conspiracy involving President Buchanan, Chief Justice Roger Taney, and Senator Stephen Douglas. Buchanan's prior knowledge and secret lobbying, when revealed, forever tainted his presidency with the charge of sordid collusion. His hope that the decision would speedily and finally settle the issue was perhaps the most disastrous political miscalculation in American history. Instead of calming the waters, he had endorsed a decision that unleashed a tidal wave of fury, radicalized millions of Northerners, drove them by the thousands into the arms of the Republican Party, and made future compromise all but impossible. His first major act as president was to champion a judicial decree that declared black people to be subhuman and slavery to be a national institution with more constitutional protection than free speech. Any illusion of him as a moderate national healer was shattered forever. While the nation reeled from the Dred Scott decision, the practical and bloody proving ground for the slavery debate remained the territory of Kansas. Under the doctrine of popular sovereignty, the settlers of Kansas were supposed to decide the issue of slavery for themselves. But the process had been a grotesque mockery of democracy from the very beginning, plagued by massive voter fraud, armed intimidation, and a brutal guerrilla war that had claimed over 50 lives. By the time Buchanan took office, Kansas was in a state of political schizophrenia, with two rival governments. The officially recognized pro-slavery territorial legislature was based in the town of Lecompton. The unofficial but popularly supported anti-slavery government was based in Topeka. The vast majority of actual settlers in Kansas were anti-slavery, but the pro-slavery faction, backed by political power in Washington and armed gangs from neighboring Missouri, clung desperately to control. Knowing they could never win a fair and open vote on slavery, the pro-slavery delegates in Lecompton devised a cunning and deeply cynical scheme. In 1857, they drafted a pro-slavery state constitution and submitted it to the people for ratification. But the referendum was a transparent fraud. Voters were not given the option to reject the Constitution entirely. Instead, they could only vote for the Constitution with slavery or the Constitution without slavery. It was a cynical trap. Even if the people of Kansas chose the without slavery option, a special clause in the Constitution protected the property rights of the 200 or so existing slaveholders in Kansas, guaranteeing that the institution would endure and providing a legal foothold for its future growth. It was a heads I win, tails you lose proposition, a swindle designed to force slavery on a territory where the overwhelming majority of people opposed it. This was James Buchanan's moment of truth, a clear test of his statesmanship and his commitment to the democratic principles he so often espoused. As president, he could have easily recognized the Lecompton Constitution as the fraud it was, rejected it, and called for a new fair vote under federal protection. This is what a true national leader would have done. Instead, driven by his deep-seated pro-Southern allegiances, the intense pressure from the powerful Southern cabal in his cabinet, and his desperate legalistic desire to resolve the toxic Kansas issue once and for all, he made another catastrophic decision. He embraced the Lecompton Constitution as the legitimate will of the people of Kansas and resolved to use the full power of his administration to ram it through Congress and admit Kansas to the Union as the 16th slave state. He declared war on his own party to achieve his goal. He cajoled, he threatened, he used the immense power of federal patronage, firing the political allies of any congressman who dared to defy him. He used lucrative government printing contracts and appointments to postmasterships and land offices as outright bribes to twist the arms of reluctant Northern Democrats. It was a sordid and shocking display of raw executive power, all in service of a document born of fraud and rejected by the people it was meant to govern. This time, however, he had pushed too far. His tyrannical actions ignited a rebellion within the Democratic Party itself, a political civil war that would have devastating consequences. The leader of the rebellion was Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, the most powerful and popular Democrat in the North. Douglas was the original author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the nation's foremost champion of popular sovereignty. For Douglas, the Lecompton Constitution was a disgusting perversion of his cherished principle. It was not the voice of the people. It was a swindle, a mockery, and an insult. In a dramatic and politically courageous act of defiance, Douglas broke openly and angrily with the Buchanan administration and led the fight against the Lecompton Constitution on the floor of the Senate. In a fiery speech, he declared, "If Kansas wants a slave state constitution, she has a right to it. But I stand on the great principle of popular sovereignty, and I will follow that principle wherever its logical consequences may take me, and I will endeavor to defend it against assault from any and all quarters." The battle in Congress was one of the most vicious and bitter in its history. It shattered the Democratic Party. Douglas and his anti-Lecompton Democrats found themselves in a strange alliance with their sworn enemies, the Republicans, fighting against their own president. The bitter infighting, the public accusations of bribery and executive tyranny tore the last great national party in two. Ultimately, the Buchanan administration managed to force the Lecompton bill through the Senate, but the alliance of Douglas Democrats and Republicans defeated it in the House of Representatives. Buchanan's push for the Lecompton Constitution failed, and Kansas later entered the Union as a free state in 1861 after his presidency. It was a victory for democracy in Kansas, but a devastating, humiliating, and fatal blow to James Buchanan. He had staked his entire political prestige on this fight and lost. He had alienated the entire northern wing of his party and had turned Stephen Douglas, its most dynamic figure, into a mortal and unforgiving enemy. The split in the Democratic Party was now irreparable, a deep and bitter division that would, in 1860, guarantee the election of a Republican president and with it, the secession of the South. Buchanan's rigid, partisan, and fundamentally dishonest handling of the Lecompton crisis was arguably his single greatest political failure, an act of presidential malpractice that directly and irrevocably paved the road to disunion. His first 2 years in office had been a relentless series of self-inflicted disasters. He had used the judiciary to try and settle the slavery question, only to inflame it. He had used executive power to try and resolve the Kansas issue, only to shatter his own party. The legal and political avenues for compromise were now destroyed, and the nation was careening ever faster toward the abyss. The presidential election of 1860 was not just a political contest. It was the final desperate referendum on the very existence of the American Republic. For decades, one institution had held America together, however precariously, the Democratic Party. It had survived through fragile, often morally bankrupt compromises. But when the party arrived in Charleston for its national convention, it was no longer a united body. It was broken. It was at war with itself. President Buchanan, a lame duck reviled by many in his own party for the Lecompton fiasco, could only watch from the sidelines as the organization he had helped to fracture prepared to commit political suicide. The setting itself was a tinderbox. Charleston was the ideological heart of the Deep South, a city seething with secessionist fervor. The convention floor was a cauldron of suspicion and animosity. The breaking point came over the party platform. Southern delegates, known as fire eaters, were no longer content with the ambiguity of popular sovereignty. Empowered by the Dred Scott decision, they demanded that the party endorse a federal slave code, a platform that would require Congress to pass laws actively protecting slavery in all federal territories. For the Northern Democrats and their champion Stephen Douglas, this was an impossible demand. To accept it would be to betray their own principle of local self-government and would mean certain political death in their home states. For days, the convention was deadlocked. The humid Charleston air crackled with tension and threats. Finally, when the Douglas supporters successfully passed a platform that did not include the slave code, the breaking point was reached. Led by the fiery William Lowndes Yancey of Alabama, the delegates from 8 southern states dramatically walked out of the convention. The great Democratic Party, the party of Jefferson and Jackson, had shattered. The convention adjourned in chaos, unable to nominate a candidate. Subsequent attempts to reunify the party in Baltimore only formalized the split. The Northern Democrats, meeting in their own convention, nominated Stephen A. Douglas. The Southern Democrats, holding a rival convention, nominated Buchanan's own vice president, John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, on a radical pro-slavery platform. Buchanan, who despised Douglas for his defiance on Lecompton, threw his administration's support behind Breckinridge, effectively sanctioning the division of his own party. Meanwhile, a fourth party, the Constitutional Union Party, emerged from the wreckage of the old Whig and Know Nothing movements. Composed of aging moderates and border state politicians, they nominated John Bell of Tennessee on a pathetically simple and nostalgic platform: to ignore the slavery issue and simply uphold the Constitution and preserve the Union, as if the country were not already engulfed in flames. This three-way split in the vote created a clear and unobstructed path to victory for the Republican Party. Meeting in the booming young city of Chicago, the Republicans, in a stroke of political genius, bypassed their more famous but more radical frontrunner, William H. Seward, and nominated the moderate former congressman from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln's relative obscurity was his greatest asset. He was a firm opponent of slavery's expansion, but he was not a radical abolitionist. He had a reputation for honesty and a compelling life story that embodied the Northern ideal of the self-made man. The Republican platform was unambiguous. Slavery would be protected by the Constitution where it already existed, but under no circumstances would it be allowed to expand into any new Western territories. The campaign was the most sectional in American history. It was in effect 2 separate elections. In the North, the race was between Lincoln and Douglas. In the South, it was between Breckinridge and Bell. Lincoln's name did not even appear on the ballot in 10 southern states. He was portrayed throughout the South as a grotesque caricature, a black Republican baboon, an abolitionist fanatic whose election would mean race war, the destruction of Southern property, and the end of their civilization. On November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln won the presidency. Though he received less than 40% of the popular vote nationwide, he secured a clear majority in the Electoral College by winning the electoral votes of every single free state except for a small split in New Jersey. He had not won a single county in the entire South. For the first time in its history, the United States had elected a president who was openly hostile to the core interests of a unified, powerful, and now terrified section of the country. The reaction in the South was swift and cataclysmic. The fire eaters, the radical proponents of secession, who had been agitating for years, now had their moment. The Union, they declared with triumphant finality, was dissolved. The period between Lincoln's election in November and his inauguration the following March was one of the most perilous and bizarre in the nation's history. It was the Secession Winter, a 4-month interregnum during which the country was effectively leaderless, adrift in a constitutional twilight zone. Abraham Lincoln was president-elect, a man with a mandate, but with no legal power to act. And James Buchanan was still president, a lame duck with all the constitutional power of the office at his command, but a man seemingly paralyzed by indecision, constitutional scruples, and a profound failure of nerve. As the nation disintegrated, the president watched. South Carolina, long the hotbed of secessionist sentiment and nullification theory, acted first. On December the 20th, 1860, a special state convention held in Charleston voted unanimously to secede from the Union. The news was greeted with joyous, riotous celebrations in the streets. Church bells rang, cannons fired, and militias paraded. The great experiment in American self-government, it seemed, was over. Over the next 6 weeks, the dominoes fell with terrifying speed as a contagion of secession swept across the Deep South. Mississippi, a state where enslaved people made up more than half the population, seceded on January 9th. Florida followed on the 10th. Alabama, the heart of the Cotton Kingdom, left on the 11th. The Empire State of the South, Georgia, followed after a contentious debate on the 19th. The sugar parishes of Louisiana took their state out of the Union on the 26th, and the vast frontier state of Texas seceded on February 1st. The Lower South, the Great Cotton Belt, was gone. This was not mere political posturing. This was nation building. In early February, delegates from these 7 sovereign and independent states met in Montgomery, Alabama, to form a new nation, the Confederate States of America. In a matter of weeks, they drafted a constitution, a document that was largely a copy of the U.S. Constitution, but one that explicitly and permanently protected the institution of chattel slavery. They elected a provisional president, the stern, austere former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, and began the serious work of creating a new government with its own cabinet, its own army, and its own national ambitions. And what of President James Buchanan? What did the leader of the crumbling nation do as his country dissolved before his very eyes? In his final annual message to Congress on December 3, 1860, with the crisis already at a fever pitch, Buchanan delivered what is perhaps the most bewilderingly contradictory and tragically impotent state paper in American presidential history. He began by forcefully, eloquently, and correctly denouncing secession. It was, he argued, unconstitutional and illegal. The Union was not a mere rope of sand, but a perpetual compact. Secession, he declared, was nothing short of revolution. He methodically dismantled the legal arguments for secession, declaring it to be a clear and dangerous violation of the sacred contract of the Constitution. Having established that secession was an illegal act of rebellion, one might have expected him to follow with a firm, Jacksonian declaration of his intent to use the power of the presidency to suppress it, to enforce the laws, and to preserve the Union. He did the exact opposite. In the very next passage, in an astonishing act of intellectual and political abdication, Buchanan argued that while no state had the right to secede, the federal government had no constitutional power to use force to compel a state to remain in the Union. To coerce a state back into the Union, he insisted, would be an act of war, a violation of the spirit of the Constitution that would transform the Union from a voluntary association of states into a consolidated despotism. His message to Congress was a masterpiece of self-destruction. In one breath, he told the South, secession is illegal. It's rebellion. And in the very next breath, he declared, but I don't have the power to stop you. It was the worst of all possible worlds. He condemned their actions legally but gave them a presidential green light to continue anyway. He blamed the North for being too aggressive and then watched as the South dismantled the country he was sworn to protect. The message was a disaster. It infuriated everyone and satisfied no one. The North was enraged that he blamed them for the crisis and had declared himself powerless to act. The secessionists were insulted that he had called their sacred act of self-government illegal, but they were also delighted that he had given them a clear green light to proceed without fear of federal intervention, at least for the next 3 crucial months. The message was a perfect encapsulation of the Buchanan presidency, a well-meaning but fatally flawed attempt to find a legalistic middle ground where none existed, a position of such profound weakness that it emboldened the nation's enemies and demoralized its friends. Buchanan's paralysis extended to the most critical and tangible issue of the secession winter, the fate of federal property in the seceding states. As Southern states seceded, their newly formed militias began seizing federal forts, arsenals, mints, and custom houses within their borders, often without a shot being fired. The local federal employees, isolated and receiving no instructions from the paralyzed government in Washington, simply handed over the keys. Soon, only a handful of military installations in the Deep South remained in Union hands. The 2 most important were Fort Pickens, off the coast of Pensacola, Florida, and, most symbolically, Fort Sumter, a formidable but unfinished brick fortress built on a man-made island in the middle of Charleston Harbor. The commander of the small federal garrison at Charleston, Major Robert Anderson, a Kentuckian of unimpeachable integrity, became a national symbol. He was a man of the South, yet his loyalty to the United States Army and the American flag was absolute. His small command was initially stationed at the vulnerable Fort Moultrie on the mainland. Surrounded by a hostile city and realizing he could not defend his position, Anderson, on his own initiative, executed a brilliant and daring maneuver on the night of December 26th. Under the cover of darkness, he spiked the guns at Moultrie and secretly moved his entire garrison, men, women, children, and supplies, to the far more defensible island fortress of Fort Sumter. The act electrified the North, who saw it as a lone gesture of defiance amid the administration's weakness. It enraged the South, who viewed it as an act of aggression. And it threw James Buchanan into a state of tormented indecision. He was caught in an impossible vice. The newly independent government of South Carolina sent commissioners to Washington to negotiate the surrender and evacuation of the fort, which they now considered to be on their sovereign territory. The powerful Southern members still remaining in Buchanan's cabinet urged him to give in and order Anderson to retreat. But a dramatic shift was occurring within his own administration. As his Southern secretaries resigned to join the Confederacy, with his Secretary of War, John B. Floyd, being forced to resign in disgrace amid charges that he had been secretly shipping federal arms to the South, they were replaced by staunch, hardline Unionists. The new Secretary of State, Jeremiah Black, the new Attorney General, Edwin Stanton, the future Secretary of War under Lincoln, and the new Secretary of War, Joseph Holt, formed a powerful pro-Union bloc within the cabinet. Horrified by the president's dithering, they pressured him, begged him, and at one point threatened to resign en masse unless he took a firmer stand and refused to surrender the fort. Under their relentless pressure, Buchanan finally, hesitantly, agreed to a secret mission to resupply and reinforce Fort Sumter. In early January 1861, an unarmed merchant ship, the Star of the West, was chartered in New York and sent south with 200 troops and supplies. But the mission was a case study in incompetence. Secrecy was lost, and word of the ship's departure was leaked to the Southern press. As the ship approached Charleston Harbor on the morning of January 9th, cadets from the Citadel manning a battery on Morris Island opened fire. The Star of the West was struck by cannonballs. Its captain, lacking any naval support and under orders not to provoke a wider conflict, made the humiliating decision to turn the vessel around and steam back to New York in retreat. The attempt to resupply the fort had failed spectacularly. The United States government had been fired upon, and it had backed down. The incident was a profound national humiliation, a clear demonstration of federal weakness that only emboldened the secessionists and made war more, not less likely. While dithering over the forts, Buchanan placed his final forlorn hopes in a last-ditch political compromise. In Congress, committees of worried moderates were formed to try and stitch the Union back together. The most prominent proposal was the Crittenden Compromise, a series of unamendable constitutional amendments offered by Senator John J. Crittenden of Kentucky. It would have protected slavery in perpetuity in the states where it existed and would have resurrected and extended the old Missouri Compromise line of 36 degrees 30 minutes to the Pacific Ocean, guaranteeing slavery in all future territories south of that line. It was a massive concession to the South, but it was too little, too late. The Deep South was already gone and had no interest in returning to the Union under any terms. And more importantly, the Republicans, led by President-elect Lincoln, stood firm on their core principle. They had just won a national election on a platform of preventing any new slave territories. They would not abandon that sacred mandate before even taking office. At Lincoln's direction, Republicans in Congress voted against the compromise, and it died. Buchanan had played the role of a helpless, pathetic spectator, offering no presidential leadership or influence to guide the process. The final days of the Buchanan administration were shrouded in an atmosphere of gloom and impending doom. Washington, D.C. was an armed camp, rife with rumors of plots by Southern sympathizers to seize the Capitol and prevent Lincoln's inauguration. General Winfield Scott, the aged commander of the Army, placed cannons at key intersections. Buchanan, for all his catastrophic faults, did ensure a peaceful transfer of power, the last and perhaps only significant service he rendered during the crisis. On March 4, 1861, he rode with Abraham Lincoln in an open carriage to the Capitol for the inauguration. As they sat together, the outgoing president, overwhelmed with relief to be shedding the unbearable burdens of his office, turned to his successor and said, "If you are as happy in entering the White House as I shall feel on returning to Wheatland, you are a happy man indeed." It was a remark that spoke volumes, a profound and pathetic admission of his own comprehensive failure. He had inherited a prosperous and united if deeply troubled nation. He bequeathed to his successor a shattered republic with 7 states gone, a rival government fully established, and federal authority in a state of utter collapse. He had not started the fire, but his presidency had been a masterclass in how to pour gasoline on smoldering embers. His rigid adherence to an outdated constitutionalism, his pro-Southern bias, his paralyzing fear of decisive action, and his complete failure to grasp the moral urgency of the moment had all combined to create a perfect storm of executive incompetence. He had presided over the nation's descent into the abyss, ensuring that Abraham Lincoln would not inherit a crisis to be managed, but a full-blown war to be fought. He had failed the ultimate test of a president, to preserve, protect, and defend the Union. As the brutal Civil War he failed to prevent raged on, James Buchanan lived out his final years at his Wheatland estate, scorned by much of the North as a traitor and the scapegoat for the nation's collapse. Haunted by his legacy, he published Mr. Buchanan's Administration on the Eve of the Rebellion in 1866, a defensive political tract blaming abolitionists and secessionists rather than himself, from fanatical abolitionists to radical secessionists. The book was a failure, only cementing his image as a leader incapable of self-reflection. On his deathbed, Buchanan tragically predicted, "History will vindicate my memory." History has done the opposite. Instead, it has judged him harshly and consistently. In survey after survey of historians, James Buchanan is invariably ranked at the very bottom, the worst president in American history. His legacy is a clear cautionary tale. His failure was not one of malice, but a disastrous combination of three key factors: a deep pro-Southern bias that clouded his judgment, a rigid legalism that paralyzed him when bold action was needed, and most critically, a failure of moral vision. He could never grasp the profound evil of slavery, viewing it as a political problem to be managed rather than a human rights catastrophe to be confronted. Ultimately, James Buchanan is an American tragedy, a man of extraordinary talent and experience who was completely unequal to the moment. He was a manager when the nation needed a leader, a bureaucrat when it needed a prophet. He was not an evil man, but a man completely unequal to the moment. His story is a chilling reminder that in a nation's greatest crisis, the most dangerous leader isn't always the one with the worst intentions, but the one who, when faced with a clear moral choice, tragically chooses nothing at all.